$1. The attorney placed the crisp bill on the polished mahogany table directly in front of me. The paper caught the afternoon light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the downtown Billings law office. For a moment, that single dollar seemed to glow like something radioactive, like something dangerous. 15 years. I'd stood beside that man for 15 years of marriage. I had held his hand when he had nothing but a rusted pickup truck and a dream scribbled on the back of a diner napkin. I had sold my grandmother's wedding ring to keep his first office open during those desperate early months. I had abandoned my nursing career, my friends, my entire identity to become the woman behind Warren Prescott's throne. And this was all he left me. $1 and a message that would echo in my ears for weeks to come. The attorney, a silver-haired man named Harrison Blakemore, cleared his throat uncomfortably. He had known Warren for decades. He had watched our marriage dissolve from the privileged vantage point of country club dinners and charity galas. Now he sat behind his massive desk, looking everywhere except at my face. His discomfort was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. "Mrs. Ashworth?" He began, adjusting his silver-rimmed glasses. The formal address stung. I had been Mrs. Prescott for 15 years. Now I was Mrs. Ashworth again, returned to my maiden name like a package sent back to sender. There is an accompanying statement that Mr. Prescott requested be read aloud. I already knew what was coming. Warren had always been theatrical in his cruelty. He was a man who believed that humiliation was best served with an audience. Every insult, every cutting remark during our marriage had been designed for maximum impact. He understood the power of witnesses. He understood that shame multiplied in the presence of others. Vivian Hale shifted on the leather sofa across the room. Her designer black dress rustled like dead leaves in autumn wind. She was 36 years old, with the kind of polished beauty that came from expensive salons and weekly spa treatments. Warren had left me for her 3 years ago, trading in his 55-year-old wife for a younger model the way some men trade in their sedans for sports cars. She was trying to suppress a smile. I could see it tugging at the corners of her perfectly lined lips. Her eyes sparkled with barely contained triumph. This moment was everything she had been waiting for, the final proof of her victory over the woman who had come before her. Harrison lifted the document. His voice dropped into that particular register attorneys use when delivering news they know will wound, a tone of practiced neutrality that somehow made everything worse. To my former wife, Corinne Ashworth, who spent 15 years claiming she never cared about my money and only wanted my heart, I leave the sum of $1, says. May it serve as a final reminder of exactly what her loyalty was worth to me. May she remember this amount every time she thinks of what she lost when she failed to appreciate what she had. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Vivian let out a soft sound, something between a laugh and a sigh of satisfaction. She had won. In her mind, this moment represented her complete and total victory over me. She had taken my husband. She had taken my home. She had taken my social standing, my future, my entire world. And now she had witnessed my final humiliation. I looked at the dollar bill on the table. Such a small thing, such an ordinary piece of paper with a dead president's face staring up at the ceiling. Washington looked almost apologetic, as if even he understood the cruelty of this moment. Warren had probably enjoyed selecting it. He had probably imagined this exact scene as he instructed his attorneys to include it in the reading. He had probably smiled that cold smile of his, the one that never quite reached his eyes. What Vivian did not know, what no one in that room could possibly have guessed, was that Warren Prescott had never truly understood the woman he married. He had seen my quiet nature as weakness. He had mistaken my patience for submission. He had assumed that because I did not fight, I could not fight. He was wrong. I reached out and picked up the dollar bill. The paper felt crisp and new between my fingers. Fresh from the bank, probably. Warren would have insisted on that. A wrinkled bill would have diminished the theatrical impact of the gesture. Even in death, he remained a perfectionist. And then I did something that no one in that room expected. I laughed. Not a bitter laugh, not a broken laugh, not the hysterical sound of a woman who had finally cracked under the weight of 3 years of poverty and abandonment. It was a genuine laugh, warm and full. The kind of laugh that comes from somewhere deep in the chest when something is truly unexpectedly amusing. The sound bounced off the wood-paneled walls and the leather-bound law books. It filled every corner of that expensive office. It seemed to grow and expand until it touched everything, until it changed the very quality of the air in the room. Vivian's smile faltered. Her perfectly threaded eyebrows drew together in confusion. This was not how the scene was supposed to play out. She had expected tears. She had expected begging. She had expected to watch me shatter into 1,000 pieces right there on the oriental rug. Instead, she was watching me laugh as if Warren had just told his favorite joke. Harrison Blakemore set down the document, clearly uncertain how to proceed. In his 30 years of practicing estate law, he had probably never witnessed a reaction quite like this. He had seen grief, he had seen anger, he had seen quiet dignity and explosive rage. But genuine amusement at one's own disinheritance was something new. I folded the dollar bill carefully, deliberately, taking my time with each crease. Then I slipped it into my worn leather purse. The bag had cost $12 at a thrift store in downtown Billings. It sat next to Vivian's Hermes clutch like a refugee beside a queen. The contrast was almost comical. "Thank you, Mr. Blakemore," I said. My voice was steady as stone. "I believe that concludes my business here." I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my navy blue skirt. It was the only decent outfit I still owned, salvaged from my former life and worn to every job interview, every court appearance, every moment when I needed to pretend I was still someone who mattered. The fabric was starting to show its age. Another year of careful maintenance, and it would be beyond saving. Vivian rose from the sofa. Her designer heels clicked against the hardwood floor like a predator's claws on marble. "That's it." Her voice dripped with disbelief. "You're just going to take your little dollar and leave? No tears, no begging." I turned to face her. She was beautiful. I could admit that without bitterness. Warren had always had excellent taste in accessories. Her skin was smooth and unlined. Her hair fell in perfect golden waves around her shoulders. Her body was toned from hours with personal trainers and carefully curated meals prepared by private chefs. She was everything I had never been, even in my youth. "What exactly would you have me beg for, Vivian? The house, the cars, some portion of what you're clearly owed after all those years." She waved a manicured hand dismissively, her diamond bracelet catching the light. I expected more of a fight. I looked at her for a long moment, taking in the designer dress, the diamond earrings that had probably cost more than I made in a year, the smug certainty in her eyes. She thought she understood the game. She thought she had won. She had no idea what was coming. "He finally paid his debt to me," I said quietly. "That's more than I expected." The words meant nothing to her. How could they? She didn't know our history. She didn't know about the promises Warren had made to me in that tiny apartment in Bozeman when we had nothing but love and hope and the naive belief that the world was ours for the taking. She didn't know about the ring I had sold, the career I had sacrificed, the years I had spent building the foundation upon which his empire now stood. She knew nothing, and I was not about to educate her. I walked toward the door, my sensible flat silent on the oriental rug. Behind me, I heard Vivian sputter something to the attorney, something about madness, about putting on a brave face, about the pathetic dignity of the destitute. I did not turn around. Her words were wind. They meant nothing to me now. The elevator ride down to the lobby took 37 seconds. I counted each one, and with each number, I felt something loosening in my chest. Some knot that had been tied there for 3 long years was finally beginning to unravel. The tension I had carried in my shoulders for what felt like a lifetime was slowly, incrementally releasing. Warren Prescott was dead. The man who had promised to love me until his last breath. The man who had instead abandoned me for a younger woman. The man who had used his army of expensive lawyers to leave me with almost nothing. That man would never hurt me again. He would never look through me as if I were invisible. He would never make me feel small and worthless and old. He was gone, and I was still here. The elevator doors opened onto the marble lobby. I stepped out into the gray Montana afternoon and took a deep breath of cold mountain air. The November wind carried the scent of coming snow. The sky was the color of old pewter, heavy with clouds that seemed to press down on the city like a giant hand. I stood there for a moment, letting the cold seep into my bones, feeling the weight of the dollar bill in my purse, remembering the woman I had been before Warren Prescott and wondering if I could ever find her again. Then I felt something I had not felt in years. Free. The laundromat sat on a forgotten stretch of Highway 87, sandwiched between a pawn shop and a bail bonds office. The fluorescent lights hummed 24 hours a day, casting everything in a sickly greenish glow that made even the healthiest person look slightly deceased. The linoleum floor was permanently sticky with spilled detergent, and the air always smelled like a combination of bleach and despair. I had worked there for 2 years and 7 months. Mabel Jennings, the owner, had hired me on the spot when I walked in with my outdated resume and my obvious desperation. She was 62 years old, a widow herself, with steel gray hair that she wore in a practical bun and hands that had been roughened by decades of honest labor. She had not asked why a woman with a nursing degree was applying for minimum wage work. She had simply handed me an apron and shown me how to operate the industrial dryers. That kindness had meant more to me than she would ever know. The morning after the will reading, I arrived at work before dawn. The sky was still dark, dotted with stars that faded as the first hints of light crept over the eastern mountains. The night shift attendant, a college kid named Marcus, was already half asleep behind the counter. He grunted a greeting and grabbed his backpack, leaving me alone with the hum of the machines and the distant sound of trucks on the highway. I made myself a cup of coffee from the ancient percolator in the back room. The coffee was terrible, bitter and burnt, the kind of brew that coated your tongue and sat heavy in your stomach. But I had grown accustomed to its particular flavor of mediocrity. I'd grown accustomed to a lot of things since Warren left. Cold showers when the water heater broke, meals of ramen noodles and canned vegetables, the constant anxiety of living paycheck to paycheck, never knowing if the next unexpected expense would send me spiraling into homelessness. The quiet shame of being a woman in her late 50s, starting over from nothing invisible to a world that valued youth and wealth above all else. The first few hours passed in their usual rhythm. A young mother came in with 3 garbage bags full of children's clothes, dark circles under her eyes and a toddler clinging to her leg. A truck driver needed his uniforms washed and pressed before his next haul, talking on his phone the entire time about delays and deadlines. An elderly man sat in the corner reading a newspaper from weeks ago that someone had left behind, seemingly content to simply exist in a space that was warm and dry. I folded towels and sorted socks and thought about nothing at all. The mechanical repetition was soothing. The mindlessness was a gift. Here in this place that smelled of soap and fabric softener, I did not have to think about Warren or Vivian or the life I had lost. I did not have to remember who I used to be. At 10 minutes past 6 in the morning, the bell above the front door chimed. I looked up from a pile of sheets, expecting to see another early morning customer. A construction worker needing clean clothes for the job site, a traveling salesman stopping through on his way to somewhere more important, the usual parade of anonymous faces that populated my days. Instead, I found myself staring at a ghost from another life. Theodore Calloway stood in the doorway of the quick clean laundromat, looking as out of place as a diamond ring in a gumball machine. He was 65 years old, with the kind of distinguished gray hair that made men look wise rather than old. His charcoal suit probably cost more than I made in 6 months. His shoes gleamed with the particular shine that only came from being hand-polished by someone who was paid to care about such things. I had not seen him since before the divorce. Ted Calloway had been Warren's attorney for over 30 years. More than that, he had been Warren's friend, perhaps his only true friend in a world where everyone wanted something from the great Warren Prescott. The two men had known each other since the early 90s, back when Warren was just another hungry young salesman trying to carve out a piece of the American dream in the wilds of Montana. I remembered Ted from the early years, from dinner parties at our modest home in Bozeman before Warren's success transformed us into people I barely recognized. Ted had been kind to me then. He had treated me like a person rather than an accessory. He had laughed at my jokes and asked about my work at the hospital and remembered my birthday when Warren forgot. I had wondered sometimes why he had helped Warren destroy me in the divorce. I had wondered if the friendship between the two men outweighed any kindness Ted might have felt toward me. I had wondered if I had ever really known him at all. Corinne. His voice was warm in a way that Harrison Blakemore's had not been. There was genuine emotion there, something that might have been guilt or sadness or a complicated mixture of both. "May I come in?" I set down the sheet I had been folding. "We're a public laundromat, Mr. Calloway. You can do whatever you like." He smiled. A small, sad smile that reached his eyes. Still the same Corinne, direct as ever. "If you're here to deliver more of Warren's insults, I'm afraid I left my dollar at home. I don't have anything smaller to give you in exchange." "I'm not here to insult you." He stepped further into the laundromat, carefully avoiding a puddle of spilled fabric softener near the door. His expensive shoes would probably need to be professionally cleaned after this visit. The thought gave me a small, petty satisfaction. "Then why are you here?" He walked toward me slowly, his hands clasped in front of him like a man approaching a wounded animal. "I'm here to tell you the truth, Corinne. A truth that Vivian doesn't know. A truth that Warren spent the last 14 months of his life carefully protecting." Something shifted in my chest. Some instinct that had kept me alive through the worst years of my life suddenly snapped to attention. I had learned to trust that instinct. It had warned me about Warren's affair months before I found the evidence. It had told me which landlords would accept late rent and which would throw me out without a second thought. It was the compass that had guided me through 3 years of darkness, and now it was telling me that everything was about to change. "I have nothing to say to you, Mr. Calloway. Your firm helped Warren hide his assets during our divorce. You helped him leave me with nothing while he—" "I know what we did." His voice was quiet but firm. There was no defensiveness in his tone, no excuses, no justifications, just a simple acknowledgement of truth. "And I also know why Warren wanted it that way. Please, Corinne, give me 15 minutes. After that, if you want me to leave, I will walk out that door and you will never see me again." Something in his tone made me pause. This was not the smooth, polished attorney voice I remembered from the divorce proceedings. This was something raw, something human. There was urgency in his words and something else, something that might have been hope. I looked at the clock on the wall. Mabel would not arrive for another hour. The laundromat was empty except for the elderly man in the corner who had fallen asleep with the newspaper spread across his chest. 15 minutes, I said. Start talking. Ted walked to the plastic chairs bolted to the floor near the window, the ones where customers waited while their clothes tumbled dry. He sat down heavily, and for the first time I noticed how tired he looked. There were shadows under his eyes that his expensive suit could not hide. His hands trembled slightly as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope. "I met Warren back in '92, he began. His voice had taken on a different quality now, softer, more reflective. He was 27 years old, selling life insurance door to door in Bozeman. He was driving a car with no working heater, eating beans from a can for dinner. I was a young attorney just starting out, sharing office space with a dentist and a tax preparer. We met at a bar where neither of us could afford more than one drink." I said nothing. I had heard pieces of this story before, back when Warren still bothered to share his history with me, back when I was still someone he wanted to impress. "He was brilliant even then," Ted continued. He could read people the way some people read books. He knew within 5 minutes of meeting someone whether they would buy, whether they could be trusted, whether they were worth his time. He paused, his eyes distant with memory, but he also had a capacity for cruelty that I sometimes found disturbing. When he felt betrayed, he did not simply walk away. He destroyed. I'm aware of that particular trait. I know you are. Ted leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The manila envelope crinkled in his hands. Which is why I need you to understand something, Corinne. That $1 he left you, that public humiliation in front of Vivian, that was not Warren's final insult to you. I stared at him, trying to process words that made no logical sense. It was his final gift. A gift. He left me $1 and a message calling me worthless. In what universe was that a gift? I don't understand. In the universe where that $1 was a legally binding trigger. Ted's eyes met mine, and I saw something burning there. Something fierce. A key that unlocked a door Vivian does not know exists. He handed me the manila envelope. It was thick, heavy with documents, the weight of secrets waiting to be discovered. 14 months ago, he said, Warren discovered something about Vivian, something that changed everything he thought he knew about his new wife and his new life. My hands were shaking as I took the envelope. I could feel the weight of revelations inside it, the heft of truths that would change everything. What did he find out? Open it. I broke the seal and pulled out the first document. It was a photograph, slightly blurry, obviously taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. The image showed Vivian standing on a hotel balcony, the Denver skyline visible in the background. Her arms were wrapped around a man who was definitely not Warren Prescott. I recognized the man immediately. Damian Holbrook, Warren's primary competitor in the commercial real estate market. The two men had been bitter rivals for over a decade, fighting over properties, contracts, political connections. Warren had once described Damian as a snake in a $1,000 suit. He had dedicated years of his life to outmaneuvering the man, to staying one step ahead in their endless chess game of acquisitions and developments. And there was Vivian pressed against him like a lover. She was having an affair. It was more than an affair. Ted's voice hardened. Keep reading. The next document was a printout of emails, dozens of them spanning months of communication between Vivian and Damian. As I read, my coffee grew cold and forgotten. My hands began to shake so badly that I had to set the papers down on my lap to keep from dropping them. They were planning to destroy Warren from the inside. Vivian had been feeding Damian confidential information about Warren's business deals, his upcoming bids on commercial properties, his financial vulnerabilities, his expansion plans. She had access to Warren's private files, his computer passwords, his most guarded secrets, and she had been passing all of it to his greatest enemy. Damian had used that information to undercut Prescott Holdings on multiple major contracts. He had cost Warren tens of millions of dollars. He had torpedoed deals that should have been certain victories. And all the while, Warren had been baffled by his rival's uncanny ability to anticipate his every move. But that was not the worst of it. I turned to the next page and the blood in my veins turned to ice. The emails revealed something far more sinister than corporate espionage. They revealed a calculated campaign to destroy Warren's health. Vivian had been deliberately creating chaos in Warren's life, manufacturing crises, starting arguments in the middle of the night, hiding important medications, making sure he never got more than a few hours of sleep. And then I saw the medical report. Warren's doctors had warned him repeatedly about his heart condition. They had told him that stress could be fatal, that he needed to reduce his blood pressure, manage his anxiety, avoid situations that elevated his cortisol levels. They had prescribed medications to help regulate his system. According to the report in my hands, Vivian had been adding compounds to Warren's evening coffee, substances designed to elevate blood pressure, to increase cortisol, to systematically damage his already weakened heart. She had known about his condition, and she had been using that knowledge as a weapon. Warren's heart attack on the golf course. I whispered. The words came out rough-scraped from somewhere deep in my throat. It wasn't natural. It was as natural as a man being pushed toward a cliff, Ted replied grimly. She didn't put poison in his food. She didn't smother him with a pillow, but she spent 14 months systematically destroying his health, knowing exactly what the consequences would be. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. She wanted him dead, Corinne. She wanted his money, and she wanted Damien Holbrook. Warren was simply an obstacle to be removed. I sat back in the plastic chair. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A dryer buzzed in the corner, signaling that someone's load was finished. The ordinary world continued around me while my understanding of everything shifted on its axis. I had hated Warren for leaving me. I'd resented him for abandoning 15 years of marriage for a younger woman. I'd spent 3 years working minimum wage jobs and eating canned soup and wondering what I had done to deserve such cruelty. But I had never wished him dead. And now I was learning that the woman he had left me for had been slowly, deliberately, methodically murdering him. Why didn't he go to the police? Because Warren Prescott was not a man who believed in simple justice. Ted stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gray Montana morning. The first snowflakes of the day were beginning to fall, drifting down from the heavy sky like tiny fragments of forgotten dreams. When he realized what Vivian was doing, he could have confronted her. He could have divorced her and exposed her crimes. But Warren spent the last 14 months of his life building a trap so elaborate, so airtight, that Vivian would not even realize she was caught until it was far too late to escape. What kind of trap? Ted turned back to face me. His eyes were bright with something that might have been admiration, or perhaps satisfaction. He transferred his real wealth, his clean assets, into a secret trust. Everything he built over decades of work, everything that actually mattered, he moved it all into an entity that Vivian's attorneys know nothing about. He paused, letting the words sink in. Then he loaded everything else, everything he left to Vivian in the public will, with massive debts and toxic liabilities. I thought about Vivian in that law office, so smug, so certain of her victory, the mansion she had inherited, the luxury cars, the stock portfolios, the bank accounts. The mansion has an $8 million lien against it, Ted continued. The cars were purchased with predatory loans that will bankrupt her when the payments come due. The stock portfolios are worthless penny stocks and failed investments that Warren accumulated specifically for this purpose. He systematically drained the actual value from every single asset he publicly left her. She had no idea. She had inherited a financial time bomb. And the dollar? I asked. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, distant, as if someone else were speaking through my mouth. Ted smiled. The first real smile I had seen from him since he walked through the door. The dollar was a legal mechanism. By accepting it in the formal reading of the will, you triggered the activation of the Prescott family trust. A trust that Vivian's attorneys know nothing about. A trust that contains Warren's actual fortune, his clean money, his real legacy. He reached into his jacket again and pulled out a small brass key. It was old, tarnished with age, attached to a leather cord that had been worn smooth by years of handling. Crestwood Manor, he said, pressing the key into my palm. A private estate in the mountains outside Bozeman, 200 acres of pristine wilderness, a fully maintained mansion that Warren purchased 30 years ago and never told anyone about, a collection of classic automobiles, and liquid assets totaling $70 million. The key was cold in my hand. It weighed almost nothing, just a small piece of brass and leather, yet it felt heavier than anything I had ever held, heavier than the wedding ring I had sold to save Warren's first business, heavier than the divorce papers I had signed 3 years ago, heavier than all the burdens I had carried through all the dark years of my abandonment. Why me? I finally managed to ask. After everything he did during the divorce, after all the cruelty, why would he leave this to me? Ted sat back down. For a moment he looked very old, very tired, as if the weight of Warren's secrets had been pressing down on him for months, and he was only now beginning to feel relief. Because Warren Prescott knew he had made the worst mistake of his life when he left you. Because in the last 14 months, watching Vivian try to destroy him, he finally understood what real loyalty meant. His voice softened. And because, in the end, he wanted you to have the last laugh. I called Mabel from the back room of the laundromat. My hands were still shaking and I had to dial the number 3 times before I got it right. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice rough with sleep. "Quick clean. This better be important." "Mabel, it's Corinne. I need to leave. I need to leave right now." There was a pause. I could hear her shifting in bed, the creak of old springs and the rustle of blankets. In the 2.5 years I had worked for her, I had never once called in sick. Never once asked for time off. Never once failed to show up exactly when I was supposed to. "Everything okay, honey?" "No," I wanted to say. "Everything is not okay. Everything I thought I knew about my life has just been turned upside down. My dead husband was murdered by his trophy wife. He left me $70 million in a secret trust, and there's an estate in the mountains that apparently belongs to me now." Instead, I said, "I can't explain right now, but I need to go." Another pause. Then Mabel said 5 words that I would never forget. "Go, I'll cover for you." That was the kind of woman Mabel Jennings was. She did not ask questions when questions were not needed. She simply stepped in and did what had to be done. Someday, when all of this was over, I would find a way to thank her properly. I hung up the phone and returned to the main room. Ted was still sitting in the plastic chair, the manila envelope resting on his lap. The elderly man in the corner had woken up and was watching us with obvious curiosity, though he made no move to approach. "I want to go there," I said. "To Crestwood Manor, right now." Ted nodded as if he had expected this. "I can drive you." "No." The word came out sharper than I intended. "I'll drive myself. You can follow if you want to." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps. Or respect. He had probably expected me to be passive, to let him guide me through this process, like a child being led by the hand. "The drive is about 4 hours," he said. "Up into the mountains past Bozeman. The roads can be treacherous this time of year, especially with snow coming." "I've lived in Montana my whole life, Mr. Calloway. I know how to drive in snow." "Of course." He stood up, straightening his expensive suit. "I'll follow in my car. If you have any trouble, flash your lights and pull over." 45 minutes later, I was behind the wheel of my 12-year-old Honda Civic, heading west on Interstate 90. The car had over 200,000 miles on it, and the heater only worked intermittently, but it had been reliable enough to get me to and from the laundromat for the past 3 years. It would have to be reliable for a few more hours. In my rearview mirror, I could see Ted's black Mercedes following at a respectful distance. The contrast between our vehicles was almost comical. His car probably cost more than I had earned in the past decade combined. The landscape of Montana unfolded around me as I drove. Vast stretches of brown grassland dotted with cattle that huddled together against the cold. Snow-capped mountains rising in the distance, their peaks disappearing into low-hanging clouds. Small towns flashing by their main streets decorated with Christmas lights that swayed in the November wind. I had lived in this state for most of my adult life, yet I had never seen the particular corner of it toward which I was now heading. Warren had always controlled our vacations, our destinations, our experiences. He had taken me to Paris and Tokyo and the Greek islands, but he had never once mentioned owning an estate in the mountains outside Bozeman. 200 acres, a mansion, $70 million. The numbers still did not feel real. The drive took just over 4 hours. We climbed higher into the Rocky Mountains, leaving behind the sprawl of Billings and entering a world of pine forests and snow-capped peaks. The road narrowed from highway to county road to private drive, and still we climbed. The Honda's engine protested the steep grades, but it kept going stubborn as the woman behind the wheel. At some point, my cell phone lost its signal. There was something both terrifying and liberating about that. The world I knew, the world of late notices and minimum wage and endless exhaustion, could not reach me here. I was beyond its grasp, if only temporarily. The private road was marked only by a stone pillar carved with the letter P. We drove through a canopy of towering pines, the afternoon light filtering through branches like something from a cathedral. The trees were ancient here, their trunks thick and their branches heavy with snow. They had stood for centuries, watching the world change around them, indifferent to the small dramas of human lives. And then the trees parted, and I saw Crestwood Manor for the first time. The estate rose from the mountainside like something from a dream. Gray stone walls covered in ivy that had turned red with the autumn cold, tall windows reflecting the November sky, a wraparound porch with rocking chairs that looked out over a private lake, its surface still and silver in the fading light. Smoke curled from one of the chimneys, suggesting warmth and habitation, despite the property's apparent isolation. Behind the main house, I could see a restored barn, several outbuildings, and a garage large enough to hold a fleet of vehicles. The grounds were immaculately maintained with gardens and pathways, and a dock extending into the crystalline water. It was beautiful in a way that hurt to look at. I parked the Honda in the circular driveway, its engine ticking as it cooled. For a long moment I simply sat there, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the house that apparently now belonged to me. "This is mine," I heard myself ask as Ted pulled up beside me. "Every acre," he said through his open window. "Every stone, every cent in the trust accounts. Warren wanted you to have all of it." The front door of the mansion opened. A woman stepped onto the porch, her silver hair gleaming in the afternoon light. She was perhaps 70 years old, with the kind of upright posture that spoke of discipline and dignity. She wore a simple gray dress and a white apron, and she stood with her hands clasped in front of her like someone who had been waiting a very long time for something important to happen. "That is Mrs. Dorothea Braddock," Ted said. "She has been the caretaker of Crestwood Manor for 35 years. She knows every secret this place holds, and she has been waiting for you since the day Warren told her you would eventually come." Mrs. Braddock made tea. It seemed like such an ordinary thing watching this elegant elderly woman move through the Manor's massive kitchen, filling a kettle and selecting cups from a cabinet that held what appeared to be antique china. The simple domesticity of tea preparation felt almost surreal against the backdrop of everything I had learned in the past few hours. The kitchen alone was larger than my entire apartment in Billings. Professional-grade appliances gleamed under warm lighting. Granite countertops stretched endlessly in every direction. Windows looked out over the private lake where the last rays of sunlight painted everything in shades of gold and amber. I sat at a heavy wooden table that could have seated 12 people comfortably. Ted had excused himself to make some phone calls, leaving me alone with the woman who had apparently been waiting decades for my arrival. "Mr. Prescott spoke of you often," Mrs. Braddock said, setting a delicate cup in front of me. The tea smelled like bergamot and honey, warm and comforting. In the early years when he first purchased this property, he would come alone and work on the grounds himself, clearing brush, repairing fences, chopping wood. He said it reminded him of who he was before the money. I didn't know Warren ever did manual labor. The Warren Prescott the world knew, and the man who came to Crestwood were very different people. She sat down across from me, her movements graceful despite her age. Her eyes were sharp and clear, the eyes of someone who saw far more than she ever spoke about. He told me once that this was the only place where he could remember the boy he used to be, the boy who fell in love with a nursing student named Corinne. I wrapped my hands around the warm cup, not trusting myself to speak. "He kept your wedding photograph in his study," she continued, "on his desk. Every time he came here, he would sit and look at it for hours. He would talk to the photograph as if you could hear him." What would he say? Mrs. Braddock's eyes softened with something that might have been compassion, or perhaps sadness. He would apologize mostly. He would tell you about his day, about his plans, about the empire he was building that meant nothing without you there to share it. She paused, her gaze drifting toward the window and the darkening sky beyond. And in the last year, after he discovered the truth about that woman, she pressed her lips together in an expression of barely concealed disgust. He would promise you that he would make things right, that he would find a way to give you everything she was trying to take from him. I set down the teacup. My hands had started trembling again, and I didn't want to spill the delicate china. Where's his study? Second floor, end of the hallway. The safe is behind the painting of the mountain. The combination is your birthday. She met my eyes steadily. He never changed it, Mrs. Ashworth, not once in 30 years. Warren's study was a room that seemed to exist outside of time. Dark wood paneling lined the walls, polished to a deep gleam. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves held leather-bound volumes that smelled of age and wisdom. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold now, but showing evidence of countless fires over the decades. A leather sofa faced the hearth, worn smooth in places where someone had sat night after night staring into flames. And there was the desk, a beautiful piece of craftsmanship made of oak that had been carved and shaped by hands long since turned to dust. It sat before windows that overlooked the lake, positioned to catch the morning light. Papers were stacked neatly on its surface. A pen lay across a legal pad as if Warren had just stepped away for a moment and would return any second. Everything was exactly as he had left it. I could see the dust motes floating in the late afternoon light. I could smell the lingering scent of pipe tobacco and old books. I could almost feel Warren's presence in the room, as if he might walk through the door at any moment and ask me why I had taken so long to find my way here. The wedding photograph was exactly where Mrs. Braddock said it would be. It sat in a silver frame on the corner of the desk, showing two young people who had no idea what the future held. Warren, 27 years old, with his dark hair and eager smile. Me, 23, in a simple white dress that I had sewn myself because we could not afford a real wedding gown. We had been so happy then, so naive, so completely unaware of the forces that would tear us apart decades later. I picked up the frame, running my fingers over the glass. The woman in the photograph was a stranger to me now. Her face was unlined, her eyes bright with hope, her smile uncomplicated by years of disappointment and betrayal. She believed in love. She believed in forever. She believed that the man holding her hand would keep all the promises he was making. I set the photograph down and walked to the painting above the fireplace. It depicted a mountain at sunset, the sky blazing with oranges and purples and golds. The style was realist, every detail rendered with loving precision. In the corner, I could see the artist's signature, though the name meant nothing to me. I swung the painting aside, revealing a wall safe with a digital keypad. My fingers trembled as I entered the 6 digits of my birth date. The numbers felt strange after all these years, a combination to a lock I had never known existed, using a date that Warren had apparently never forgotten. There was a soft click, and the door swung open. Inside, I found 3 leather-bound journals, a stack of photographs bound with a rubber band, a red folder marked confidential in Warren's aggressive handwriting, and something else, an envelope that had been placed on top of everything else, as if it had been added recently. The envelope was addressed to Warren. The return address was a law firm in Billings. The date on the postmark was 3 days before his death. I opened it with trembling hands and began to read. It was a letter from Vivian's attorneys. They had somehow discovered the existence of the Prescott Family Trust. They did not know the details, the letter made that clear, but they knew enough to be concerned. They were demanding a full accounting of Warren's assets. They were threatening legal action if their demands were not met. Vivian knew. She did not know everything, but she knew enough to be dangerous. She knew that Warren had hidden something from her. She knew that the inheritance she was counting on might not be as secure as she had believed, and according to the letter, she was already preparing to fight. I stood there in Warren's study, holding evidence of a battle that had not yet begun. The peace I had felt in that law office, the freedom I had tasted when I walked out with my dollar bill, was already slipping away. Warren had left me a fortune. He had left me a beautiful estate in the mountains. He had left me the means to rebuild my life and live out my remaining years in comfort and dignity. But he had also left me a war. Vivian Hale was coming. She was coming with her lawyers and her lies and her desperate hunger for money that she believed was rightfully hers. She was coming to take everything Warren had tried to give me. I looked out the window at the lake, now dark under the evening sky. The first stars were beginning to appear, pinpricks of light in the vast Montana darkness. Somewhere out there, Vivian was probably celebrating her victory, drinking champagne with friends who did not know that the woman they were toasting was a murderer. She thought she had won. She had no idea that the real game was just beginning. I closed the safe and walked back to the desk. I sat down in Warren's chair, feeling the leather conform to my body. I picked up the wedding photograph again and looked at the young couple frozen in silver and glass. "You left me a mess," I said quietly to Warren's smiling face, "but you also left me the tools to clean it up. I just hope you knew what you were doing." The photograph did not answer. It never would. But somewhere deep in my chest, in that place where instinct lived and breathed and guided my steps through darkness, I felt something new. Something I had not felt in 3 years of poverty and struggle and quiet desperation. Purpose. I had a fight ahead of me. I had enemies who would stop at nothing to take what Warren had given me. I had a dead husband whose final wishes I was only beginning to understand. But I also had something that Vivian Hale didn't have, something that no amount of money or lawyers or scheming could ever buy. I had the truth, and I was going to use it. The journals told a story of betrayal that went deeper than I had ever imagined. I spent 3 days in Warren's study reading every word he had written in the final 14 months of his life. The leather-bound books were filled with his aggressive handwriting, the same script I remembered from grocery lists and birthday cards, and the occasional love note left on my pillow during the happier years of our marriage. But these were not love notes. These were the records of a man who had discovered that his wife was trying to kill him. The first entry was dated September the 3rd, 14 months before Warren's death. I could almost hear his voice as I read the words, that particular cadence he adopted when he was working through a problem, when his brilliant mind was turning something over and examining it from every angle. "I found Vivian's phone today. She left it on the bathroom counter while she was in the shower. I was not looking for anything. I was simply going to move it so it would not get wet. But the screen lit up with a notification, and I saw his name, Damian Holbrook. She has been meeting him at the Grandview Hotel every Tuesday for at least 6 months. The messages go back further than I can stomach to read. I turned the page and the entries continued. I'm a fool. A vain, stupid, lonely fool who thought that a younger woman could somehow erase the worst mistake of my life. But I cannot confront her, not yet. I need to understand the full scope of what she has done. I need to know exactly who I married. Warren had hired a private investigation firm. Former federal agents who specialized in corporate espionage and domestic surveillance. They had followed Vivian for weeks, documenting her movements, intercepting her communications, building a case that grew more damning with each passing day. The affair had not been a spontaneous passion. It had been a calculated attack. Vivian and Damian had been planning Warren's downfall for years. Their relationship predated her marriage to Warren by nearly 2 years. They had identified him as a target, researched his weaknesses, engineered the entire romance as a long-term strategy to access his wealth and destroy his business from within. The seduction, the whirlwind courtship, the marriage that had seemed to come out of nowhere, all of it had been orchestrated by 2 predators who saw Warren Prescott as nothing more than a mark. I read about the stolen bid proposals that cost Prescott Holdings millions. I read about the fabricated scandals designed to distract Warren while Damian moved against him in the market. I read about the careful, deliberate campaign to undermine everything Warren had built over decades of work. And then I reached the entry that made me set down the journal and stare out the window for nearly an hour. October 15th. I found the supplements in her bathroom cabinet. At first I thought they were vitamins. She takes so many pills every day. But something about them bothered me. The labels were wrong. The bottles were not from any pharmacy I recognized. I had them analyzed by a laboratory in Denver. The results confirmed my worst fears. She has been adding compounds to my evening coffee for months, substances designed to elevate blood pressure and cortisol. She wants me dead, Corinne. Slowly, carefully, in a way that will never be traced back to her. Warren had known. For nearly a year he had known that the woman sharing his bed was systematically destroying his health. He had continued to drink the coffee she prepared. He had continued to pretend that nothing was wrong. He had continued to play the part of the unsuspecting husband while he built his elaborate trap. The courage that must have required was almost incomprehensible. Every night he had watched her add poison to his cup. Every morning he had woken up knowing that his heart was a little weaker, his body a little more damaged. He had felt himself dying by inches, and he had chosen to let it happen because he needed time to set his affairs in order. He had sacrificed months of his life to ensure that I would be protected. The journals contained occasional references to me, brief mentions that suggested Warren had never stopped thinking about the woman he had left behind. But it was clear that he had kept his deeper feelings separate, compartmentalized in some other place I had not yet discovered. The man in these pages was not the Warren I had known during the last years of our marriage. He was not the cold, distant husband who had looked through me as if I were invisible. He was not the cruel man who had instructed his lawyers to leave me with nothing. He was the Warren I had married. The young man with the brilliant smile and the endless ambition. The man who had loved me with a fierce, consuming passion that had seemed like it would last forever. That Warren had never truly disappeared. He had simply been buried beneath layers of wealth and ego and the peculiar madness that comes from too much success achieved too quickly. And in his final months, facing death at the hands of a woman who had never loved him, that original, Warren had clawed his way back to the surface. He had used his last reserves of strength to make things right. And now I was holding the evidence of that final redemption in my hands. Over the following days, I began to meet the people who had known Warren in his secret life at Crestwood. Pastor Lyle Whitaker came to visit on my third morning at the Manor. He was 68 years old, with kind eyes and hands that had clearly known manual labor before they learned to hold a Bible. His church was a small white building in the town of Pinewood, about 20 minutes down the mountain. The congregation numbered less than 100 souls, mostly ranchers and their families, who had worked this land for generations. Warren Prescott was a complicated man. He told me sitting on the porch with a cup of Mrs. Braddock's excellent coffee. The morning was cold, but the sun was bright, and the view of the mountains was spectacular enough to make even the November chill feel tolerable. He donated the money to rebuild our church roof 5 years ago, asked that we never tell anyone where the funds came from, said he didn't want the publicity. That doesn't sound like the Warren I knew. Maybe that's because you knew the Warren who was trying to impress the world. Pastor Whitaker wrapped his weathered hands around his mug steam rising between his fingers. Out here, he didn't have anyone to impress. He could just be a man who wanted to do some good. He told me stories. Warren helping to build a new fellowship hall with his own hands. Warren visiting the sick and elderly, bringing groceries and firewood and quiet conversation. Warren sitting in the back pew on Sunday mornings, singing hymns in a voice that was slightly off-key, but full of genuine feeling. It was like hearing about a stranger I might have liked if I had ever been given the chance to meet him. Opal and Chester Rawlings arrived that afternoon with a casserole and stories that went back decades. They were in their early 70s, married for over 50 years with the easy comfort of two people who had long since stopped needing words to communicate. Their ranch bordered the eastern edge of Crestwood, separated by a fence line that Warren had helped them repair more than once. "Warren saved our ranch," Chester said. His weathered face was serious, his voice rough with emotion. 12 years ago, the bank was about to foreclose. We'd had 3 bad years in a row. Drought, then disease in the herd, then a fire that took out half our winter feed. We were going to lose everything my grandfather built. Opal reached over and took her husband's hand. Warren paid off our loan, just walked into the bank and wrote a check. Told us we could pay him back whenever we were able, and if we were never able, that was fine too. We paid him back, Chester added quickly. Took us 8 years, but we paid every cent. He never charged us a penny of interest. I listened to these stories with growing confusion. The Warren they described bore little resemblance to the man who had coldly instructed his attorneys to leave me with nothing during our divorce. How could the same person be so generous here and so cruel in his other life? I asked Mrs. Braddock that evening after the visitors had gone and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet. She considered the question carefully, her silver hair gleaming in the firelight. Perhaps generosity and cruelty are not opposites, Mrs. Ashworth. Perhaps they are both expressions of the same need for control. She poured me a glass of wine from a bottle that probably cost more than a month of my laundromat wages. Warren wanted to control how people saw him. Here he controlled that image by being generous. In the business world, he controlled it by being ruthless. Both versions were real. Both versions were Warren. It was as good an explanation as any, and it helped me understand something that had been nagging at me since I first opened those journals. Warren had not suddenly become a different person in his final months. He had simply allowed the better parts of himself to take control for once. He had set aside his pride and his ego and his need to dominate, and he had focused all of his considerable intelligence on a single goal: protecting me. Making things right. The man who had hurt me so badly was also the man who had sacrificed everything to ensure my future. I didn't know how to reconcile those two truths, but I was beginning to understand that I might not need to. The attack came 3 weeks after I arrived at Crestwood Manor. I was in the library working through a stack of financial documents that Ted had sent over for my review. The trust was more complex than I had initially understood, with investments and properties and accounts scattered across multiple states and several foreign countries. Understanding it all would take months, possibly years. But I had time now, and resources, and a team of professionals whose job it was to help me navigate this new reality. The phone rang just after 2 in the afternoon. "Mrs. Ashworth?" Ted's voice was tight with controlled tension. "We have a problem." "What kind of problem?" "Vivian has hired attorneys, not just any attorneys, the most aggressive litigation firm in Montana. They have filed a lawsuit challenging the validity of the Prescott family trust." I set down the documents I'd been reading. On what grounds? Mental incapacity. They are claiming that Warren was suffering from cognitive decline during the period when the trust was established, that he was not of sound mind, that you somehow manipulated him into creating this arrangement. The accusation was absurd. I had not spoken to Warren in 3 years. I had not known about Crestwood Manor or the trust until Ted appeared at the laundromat. How could I have manipulated a man I never saw? But in the American legal system, absurd accusations still required responses. "There's more," Ted continued. "Vivian has hired a public relations firm. They are beginning a media campaign to discredit you." "What are they saying?" "That you are a bitter ex-wife who preyed on your former husband during a period of mental vulnerability. That you used your history together to manipulate him into disinheriting his legal widow. They are painting you as a con artist, Corinne, a predator who targeted a dying man." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. For 3 years I'd been invisible, anonymous, a middle-aged woman working the night shift at a laundromat beneath the notice of anyone who mattered. Now, suddenly, I was being thrust into the spotlight, and the story being told about me was a lie. What can we do? We fight back. We gather evidence. We prove that Warren was mentally competent and that his decisions were his own. Ted paused. "But I want you to be prepared. This is going to get ugly before it gets better." He was right. Over the following weeks, Vivian's assault intensified. The lawsuit was led by her niece, Bridget Hale. She was 28 years old, fresh out of law school, with the hungry ambition of someone who had grown up watching her aunt's lifestyle and wanted desperately to achieve the same heights. She did not have the experience or skill to challenge the trust on her own, but she had the backing of her aunt's money and the guidance of the senior partners at her firm. Together, they mounted a campaign that was as vicious as it was effective. Articles began appearing in local newspapers, stories about the tragic widow Vivian Hale, victimized first by her husband's death and now by his scheming ex-wife. Anonymous sources questioned my character, my motives, my sanity. They painted a picture of a desperate woman who had somehow gotten her hooks into a dying man and convinced him to abandon his legal obligations. The stories were filled with inaccuracies and outright lies, but they were also filled with enough half-truths to be dangerous. Yes, I had worked at a laundromat for minimum wage. Yes, I had struggled financially since the divorce. Yes, I had lost my nursing career and my social standing and my entire way of life. These facts were presented as evidence of my desperation, proof that I would do anything to reclaim the wealth I had lost. The truth that Warren had destroyed me deliberately as part of his divorce strategy was conveniently omitted. Then came the threats. The first incident happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I had driven into Pinewood to pick up supplies from the general store. When I returned to my car, I found a brick sitting on the hood surrounded by a spider web of cracked glass. A note was tucked under the windshield wiper. "Gold digger, go back where you came from." I stood there for a long moment staring at the damage. The hatred behind the act was palpable, as real and heavy as the brick itself. Someone in this town believed Vivian's lies. Someone was angry enough to act on that belief. 2 days later, a letter arrived at Crestwood Manor. It was unsigned, written in block letters on cheap paper. "We know what you did. We know you manipulated a dying man to steal his money. You don't belong here. Leave now or face the consequences." I showed the letter to Mrs. Braddock. She read it with a steady expression, then set it down on the kitchen table. "Fear is their weapon, Mrs. Ashworth. They want you to run. They want you to give up." "Should I go to the police?" "You can, but it will not stop them. The only way to end this is to win, to prove that you have every right to be here." She met my eyes steadily. "Can you do that?" I thought about the journals upstairs, the evidence of Vivian's crimes, the proof that Warren had been murdered by the woman who now posed as his grieving widow. "Yes," I said. "I can do that." The false defeat came when I least expected it. Ted arrived at Crestwood on a Thursday evening, his face grim. He had been reviewing the trust documents with his legal team, preparing for the court challenge that was now inevitable. What he had found had shaken him badly enough to drive 4 hours through a snowstorm to deliver the news in person. "We have a problem," he said, shaking snow from his coat in the entryway. "A serious problem." We sat in Warren's study, a fire crackling in the massive stone fireplace. Outside, the storm howled against the windows, piling snow on the windowsills and bending the pine trees nearly horizontal. "One of the witnesses who signed the trust documents has died," Ted explained. "Arthur Pemberton. He was a retired judge who Warren had known for decades. His signature was on several key documents attesting to Warren's mental competency at the time of signing." "When did he die?" 6 months ago. Natural causes according to the death certificate. But here's the problem." Ted leaned forward, his expression troubled. "Without Arthur's testimony, we cannot definitively prove that Warren was competent when he signed those documents. Vivian's attorneys are already preparing to argue that the signatures were forged, or that Arthur was coerced, or that the documents were somehow altered after the fact." I felt the floor shift beneath me. "Are you saying they could win?" "I'm saying that without additional evidence, they could tie this up in court for years. And during that time, the trust assets would be frozen. You would not have access to any of Warren's money. The estate would be in legal limbo. And Vivian would use every trick in the book to drain the accounts through legal fees and court costs. Everything I had been given could be taken away. The $70 million, the estate, the future Warren had tried to secure for me. All of it was suddenly at risk because one elderly man had died of natural causes 6 months ago. For a moment, despair washed over me like a cold wave. 3 years of poverty had taught me how to survive on almost nothing. But the thought of returning to that life of losing everything just as I was beginning to believe it was real was almost more than I could bear. Then, something else rose up inside me. Something harder. Something fiercer. I had not survived 3 years of darkness only to be destroyed by Vivian Hale's lies. "What do we need to prove?" I asked. My voice was steady, though my heart was racing, to establish that Warren was competent. Testimony from people who knew him during the relevant period, medical records showing his mental state, any evidence that demonstrates his ability to make sound decisions. The people in Pinewood, Pastor Whitaker, the Rawlings family, they all knew Warren. They all interacted with him regularly. Their testimony would help, but Vivian Hale's attorneys will argue that they only knew him in this context, that his behavior at Crestwood was not representative of his overall mental state. I stood up and walked to the window. The storm was intensifying, visibility dropping to near zero. The world outside had become a wall of white, impenetrable and fierce. "Then we need more," I said. "We need his doctors, his business associates. Anyone who can testify that Warren knew exactly what he was doing when he set up this trust. That will take time and resources. I have both." I turned back to face Ted. "Warren left me $70 million. I intend to use every penny of it if necessary to prove that his final wishes were legitimate. Vivian thinks she can outspend me. She thinks she can outlast me. She is wrong." Ted studied me for a long moment. Whatever he saw in my face seemed to satisfy him. "All right," he said, "we fight." I didn't wait for the lawyers to do my work for me. Over the following weeks, I became my own investigator. I drove through snowstorms to interview Warren's doctors in Billings. I tracked down former business associates who could speak to his mental acuity. I collected statements and affidavits and signed declarations from anyone who had interacted with Warren during the period when the trust was established. Pastor Whitaker provided a detailed account of Warren's visits to the church. He described conversations about theology and philosophy, complex discussions that demonstrated a sharp and engaged mind. He talked about Warren's careful planning for the church renovation, his attention to detail, his clear understanding of budgets and timelines. Chester and Opal Rawlings testified to Warren's business acumen. They described how he had analyzed their ranch's finances, identified areas for improvement, helped them develop a long-term strategy for recovery. These were not the actions of a man suffering from cognitive decline. These were the actions of a brilliant mind still operating at full capacity. Mrs. Braddock's testimony was perhaps the most powerful. She had worked for Warren for 35 years. She had seen him every day during his visits to Crestwood. She could speak to his routines, his habits, his conversations, his decisions. She could describe in exhaustive detail the Warren Prescott who had lived in this house, and that man was not mentally incompetent. Mabel Jennings drove 4 hours from Billings to add her voice to the chorus. She arrived on a bitter cold afternoon, her practical sedan caked with road salt and her steel gray hair escaping from under a knitted cap. I met her at the door of the manor, and for a moment we simply embraced, two women who had found friendship in the most unlikely of circumstances. "I'm not here to testify about Warren," she said over coffee in the kitchen. "I barely knew the man, but I can testify about you. About me. About the woman you are, the woman you became during those 2.5 years at my laundromat." Her weathered hands wrapped around her mug. "I watched you, Corinne. I saw you come in broken and desperate, and I watched you rebuild yourself through sheer force of will. You never complained. You never made excuses. You showed up every day and did the work no matter how tired you were or how badly life had treated you. I don't understand how that helps. It helps because it proves you're not a con artist. You're not a schemer. You're not the kind of woman who manipulates dying men for their money." Mabel's eyes met mine steadily. "You're the kind of woman who works double shifts at a laundromat to pay her rent. The kind of woman who maintains her dignity even when she has every reason to give up. That's who you are, Corinne. And I intend to make sure the court knows it." It was during my search through Warren's files that I made the discovery that changed everything. I had been looking for financial records, anything that might help establish the timeline of the trust's creation. The filing cabinets in Warren's study were extensive, containing decades of documents organized with the meticulous precision that had characterized his business dealings. In the bottom drawer of the third cabinet, I found a folder labeled simply with my name. Inside were photographs, dozens of them spanning the 3 years since our divorce. Photographs of me at the laundromat folding clothes and talking to customers. Photographs of me walking to my apartment, groceries in hand. Photographs of me sitting alone on a park bench staring at nothing. Photographs of me leaving the courthouse after yet another failed attempt to find work in my former profession. Warren had been watching me. For 3 years, while I struggled and starved and fought to survive, he had been having me followed. He had documented my decline with the same precision he applied to his business dealings. He had watched me suffer and done nothing to help. At first, the discovery filled me with rage. How dare he observe my pain like some kind of experiment? How dare he sit in his mansion while I counted pennies and ate ramen and wondered if I would have to sleep in my car? But then I found the journal entry that corresponded to the photographs. I wanted to go inside the laundromat. I wanted to fall at her feet and beg for forgiveness, but I could not. If Vivian found out that I was still thinking about Corinne, everything would unravel. The trap I was building, the protection I was trying to put in place, all of it would collapse. I need more time. I need to finish what I have started, and then maybe I can find a way to make things right. He had not watched me suffer out of cruelty. He had watched me because he could not stop himself, because he loved me still even after everything he had done, because he was waiting, planning, building the elaborate trap that would eventually bring me to Crestwood Manor. Every photograph was a record of his helpless love. Every journal entry was a confession of guilt and longing and desperate hope. Warren had not abandoned me when he divorced me. He had simply lost sight of himself for a while, blinded by Vivian's manipulations and his own weakness. And when he finally saw clearly again, he had dedicated the remaining months of his life to setting things right. He had died still loving me. And I had spent 3 years hating a man who was trying to save me. The hearing was held in a courthouse in Bozeman on a gray December morning. The room was smaller than I had expected, with wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead. The judge was a woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes and an expression that suggested she had seen every possible manipulation wealthy people could devise. I sat at a long table beside Ted, facing the bench. Across the aisle, Bridget Hale sat next to Vivian, both of them dressed in expensive black suits that projected an image of respectable grief. Vivian looked different than she had at the will reading. The smugness was gone, replaced by something harder and more desperate. She had lost weight in the weeks since Warren's death, and her designer clothes no longer fit quite right. The dark circles under her eyes could not be hidden by even the most expensive makeup. The financial collapse Warren had engineered was already taking its toll. Bridget presented her case with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in her entire privileged life. She argued that Warren had been suffering from cognitive decline, that his decisions were not his own, that I had somehow manipulated him from afar through methods she could not quite explain but was certain had occurred. Ted responded methodically, presenting our evidence piece by piece. The testimony of Warren's doctors, who confirmed he had shown no signs of mental impairment. The statements from his business associates, who described a man still operating at the peak of his abilities. The declarations from the people of Pinewood, who had known Warren as a clear-minded philanthropist and good neighbor. And then I took the stand. I had not planned to testify. Ted had advised against it, warning that Bridget would try to twist my words to paint me as exactly the kind of manipulative schemer Vivian wanted the court to see. But as I sat there listening to lies being told about Warren, about me, about the nature of our marriage and its end, something inside me broke. I needed to speak. I needed the judge to hear the truth from my own lips. I stood up without waiting for Ted's permission and walked to the witness stand. The judge raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Bridget exchanged a confused glance with Vivian. "My name is Corinne Ashworth," I began. My voice was steady, though my heart was pounding. "I was married to Warren Prescott for 15 years. During that time, I sold my grandmother's wedding ring to keep his first business afloat. I abandoned my career as a nurse to support his ambitions. I gave him the best years of my life, and I did it willingly because I loved him and believed that we were building something together. I looked directly at Vivian. Her face was pale, her jaw tight. When Warren left me for a younger woman, I did not fight. I didn't demand my fair share of the wealth I had helped him build. I accepted the divorce settlement his attorneys offered because I was too exhausted and too broken to fight anymore. I walked away with almost nothing, and I spent the next 3 years rebuilding my life from scratch. I turned back to the judge. I worked the night shift at a laundromat for minimum wage. I lived in a studio apartment with a broken heater and a view of a parking lot. I ate canned soup and off-brand cereal because that was all I could afford. And during all that time, I never once reached out to Warren. I never asked him for help. I never tried to manipulate him or contact him or remind him of what he owed me. My voice cracked slightly, but I pushed on. Warren Prescott made his own decisions. He established the trust without any input from me. He chose to leave his fortune to the woman he should never have left. And he did it because in the end, he realized what he had lost. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was one of Warren's journal entries describing his reasons for creating the trust. I had brought it with me, unsure if I would ever use it. Now I smoothed it out on the witness stand and began to read. I am building this trust for Corinne because she was the best thing that ever happened to me. She was the only real thing in a life full of illusions. I was too proud and too foolish to see it until it was too late. I hope that someday she can think of me without hatred. I hope that the gift I leave her brings her some measure of peace. The courtroom was silent. Bridget opened her mouth to object, but no words came out. Vivian's face had gone white. The judge studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned to review the documents Ted had submitted, the mountain of evidence we had gathered over weeks of desperate work. The deliberation took 3 days. 3 days during which I barely slept, barely ate, barely did anything except sit in Warren's study and stare at his wedding photograph and wonder if I had done enough. On the 4th day, the judge issued her ruling. The Prescott Family Trust is valid and legally binding. The evidence clearly demonstrates that Warren Prescott was of sound mind when he established the trust, and that he had legitimate reasons for his testamentary decisions. The plaintiff's claims are dismissed with prejudice. Dismissed with prejudice. Legal words that meant Vivian could never file this challenge again. The trust was mine. The estate was mine. The future Warren had tried to secure for me was safe. Bridget's face went white. Vivian let out a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. I sat very still, afraid to move, afraid to believe it was actually over. Ted reached over and squeezed my hand. You won, Corinne. The trust is yours. No one can take it from you now. But the victory was not complete. Immediately after the ruling, Ted pulled me aside in the courthouse hallway. His face was serious, more serious than I had seen it since this whole ordeal began. There's something you need to know, he said quietly. Something that happened while we were focused on the hearing. What is it? The FBI arrested Damian Holbrook yesterday. Securities fraud, insider trading, conspiracy to manipulate stock prices. He's facing decades in federal prison. I processed this information slowly. Damian Holbrook, Vivian's lover and co-conspirator. The man who had helped her steal Warren's business secrets. The man who had plotted with her to accelerate Warren's death. During the investigation, Ted continued, the FBI found communications between Damian and Vivian, emails and text messages discussing their plans, including explicit references to making sure Warren's health problems progressed quickly. The FBI wants to interview Vivian about her possible involvement in Warren's death. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Vivian was not just facing financial ruin, she was facing potential murder charges. They want access to the evidence Warren gathered, Ted said. The laboratory reports on the supplements, the surveillance photographs, the journal entries, all of it could be used to build a case against her. I thought about the red folder sitting in Warren's safe. The folder marked confidential, the evidence that could destroy Vivian completely, that could send her to prison for the rest of her life. Warren had left that folder for me. He had given me the power to choose. What happens now? That's up to you, Corinne. You can cooperate with the FBI, hand over the evidence, let them build their case. Ted paused. Or you can keep the folder locked away, let Vivian face the consequences of the financial trap Warren set for her. Bankruptcy, disgrace, the destruction of everything she thought she had won, but not prison, not a murder conviction. Two paths stretched out before me, justice or mercy, revenge or peace. That night I sat alone in Warren's study, the red folder in my hands. The fire crackled in the hearth. Snow fell silently outside the windows. The house was quiet, peaceful, a sanctuary from the storms of the world. I did not open the folder. I simply held it, feeling its weight, thinking about the choice that lay before me. And then I heard the sound of an engine in the distance. A car was approaching Crestwood Manor through the storm. I walked to the window and looked out. Through the swirling snow, I could see headlights coming up the private road. The vehicle was small, battered, nothing like the luxury cars Vivian usually drove. As I watched the car reach the iron gates at the end of the driveway, it stopped there, engine idling, lights cutting twin beams through the darkness. Then a figure emerged. Even from this distance, through the snow and the darkness, I recognized her. Vivian Hale stood at the gates of Crestwood Manor, looking up at the house where her victim's true legacy waited. Her expensive coat was wrinkled and stained. Her designer heels sank into the snow. Her hair whipped around her face in the wind, tangled and disheveled. She looked nothing like the triumphant woman who had smirked at me in the law office just weeks ago. She looked desperate, broken, afraid. And as I watched, she fell to her knees in the snow, clasped her hands together and began to scream my name through the storm. Corinne. Please, I know you're there. Please, I need to talk to you. I stood at the window, the red folder still clutched in my hands. Vivian continued to kneel in the snow, her voice growing hoarse with cold and desperation. Please, I'm begging you. I have nowhere else to go. The FBI is coming for me. Damien abandoned me. I have nothing left. Please, just give me 5 minutes. I'm pregnant, Corinne. I'm carrying Damien's child. Please, you can't just let me die out here. Pregnant. The word hit me like a punch to the stomach. A child. An innocent life growing inside the woman who had murdered my husband. I looked down at the red folder in my hands. The evidence of Vivian's crimes. The weapon Warren had left me. And I realized that the choice I had been contemplating was no longer theoretical. Vivian Hale was kneeling at my gates, pregnant and desperate, begging for mercy from the woman she had tried to destroy. The final confrontation had arrived, and I had to decide once and for all what kind of person I was going to be. The storm had transformed Crestwood Manor into an island. Snow fell in thick curtains, obscuring the mountains and the lake and everything beyond the iron gates at the end of the driveway. The wind howled through the pine trees, bending branches that had stood for centuries, piling drifts against the stone walls of the house. The world had shrunk to this single point of light and warmth in an ocean of white darkness. And at the gates, Vivian Hale knelt in the snow, screaming my name. I stood at the window of Warren's study, watching her through the swirling storm. The red folder was still clutched in my hands, the evidence of her crimes pressing against my palms like something alive. The fire crackled behind me, casting dancing shadows across the wood-paneled walls. She looked nothing like the woman who had smirked at me in the law office just weeks ago. Her designer coat was soaked through, clinging to her thin frame. Her hair hung in frozen tangles around her face. Her makeup had run, leaving dark streaks down her cheeks that made her look like a tragic mask from some ancient Greek drama. She was shivering violently, her whole body convulsing with cold. Mrs. Braddock appeared in the doorway of the study, her silver hair gleaming in the firelight. Her face was calm, composed, the face of a woman who had seen too much of life to be surprised by anything anymore. Mrs. Ashworth, there is a situation at the gates. A woman is demanding entry. She appears to be in some distress. I can see her. Shall I have security remove her from the property? I watched Vivian through the window. She had stopped screaming now, perhaps saving her strength, or perhaps simply too cold to continue. She remained on her knees in the snow, her hands clasped in front of her like a supplicant before an altar. The wind whipped around her, tugging at her ruined coat, scattering snow across her bowed head. She had tried to kill my husband. She had conspired with his enemy to destroy his business. She had fed him poison disguised as supplements. She had manufactured stress and chaos and sleepless nights, knowing that each one brought him closer to the fatal heart attack that would finally set her free. She deserved to freeze out there in the snow. She deserved whatever the FBI was planning to do to her. She deserved nothing from me. But as I watched her shivering in the darkness, something else stirred inside me. Something that had nothing to do with justice or revenge or the complicated mathematics of who owed what to whom. I thought about the woman I had been 3 years ago. The woman who had walked out of the divorce proceedings with nothing but a settlement that would barely cover 6 months of rent. The woman who had sold her grandmother's ring and abandoned her career and given everything to a man who would eventually throw her away like a used tissue. That woman had been desperate too. That woman had known what it felt like to have nothing, to be nothing, to stand at the edge of an abyss with no idea how to take the next step. I was not that woman anymore. Warren's gift had changed everything. I had money now and security and a future that stretched out before me like a road leading to places I'd never imagined. I had won. Vivian had lost. The balance of power had shifted so completely that she was now kneeling in the snow, begging for mercy from the woman she had tried to destroy. I could leave her out there. I could watch her freeze. I could let the FBI take her and spend the rest of her life in federal prison, or I could choose a different path. Let her in through the pedestrian gate, I said. I will meet her at the front door. Mrs. Braddock's expression did not change, but something flickered in her eyes. Something that might have been approval, or perhaps understanding. As you wish, Mrs. Ashworth. 10 minutes later, I stood beneath the stone portico of the manor, sheltered from the wind, but not from the cold. The snow had accumulated several inches since the storm began, covering the gravel driveway in a blanket of white that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Vivian trudged up the long path from the gates, her expensive shoes sinking into the snow with each step. She walked hunched over, arms wrapped around herself, shivering so violently that she could barely maintain her balance. The journey that should have taken 2 minutes stretched into 10 as she stumbled and recovered and stumbled again. When she finally reached the portico, she stopped at the bottom of the stone steps and looked up at me. The transformation was shocking. This was not the polished, confident woman who had sat across from me in the law office, radiating smug satisfaction as Warren's final insults were read aloud. This was a broken creature, stripped of everything that had made her dangerous. Her eyes were hollow, rimmed with red, filled with a desperation that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than mere physical discomfort. "Thank you." Her voice was barely a whisper, scraped raw by cold and screaming. "Thank you for letting me in." "I haven't let you in yet." I kept my voice neutral, controlled. "You said you wanted to talk. So talk. Please. Can we go inside? I'm freezing. I've been out there for almost an hour." "You can say what you need to say from where you are." Something flickered across her face, anger perhaps, or frustration. The old Vivian would have pushed, would have manipulated, would have found some way to turn the situation to her advantage. But this Vivian was too exhausted, too desperate, too close to the edge of complete collapse. "I need your help." The words came out flat, stripped of artifice. "I have nothing left. The mansion is gone. The bank seized it 2 days ago. The cars, the jewelry, everything Warren left me, all of it was worthless. Debts and liens and toxic investments. I'm completely bankrupt." "I know." "Damien was arrested yesterday. The FBI is building a case against him for securities fraud, insider trading, conspiracy, and they found our communications." Her voice cracked. They found the emails where we discussed Warren's health, where we talked about making sure his condition progressed quickly. They're coming for me, Corinne. They're going to charge me with conspiracy to commit murder. I know that too. I need money. Enough to leave the country before they come for me. $500,000. It's nothing to you now. Warren left you $70 million. $500,000 is less than 1% of that. Please, Corinne, I know I don't deserve your help. I know I did terrible things, but I'm begging you. I have nowhere else to turn. I looked at her for a long moment, studying the desperation in her eyes. The old Vivian would have been playing a role designed to manipulate me into giving her what she wanted. But this Vivian was beyond performance. This was raw, unfiltered terror, the terror of a woman who had finally realized that she was not as clever as she had always believed. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a photocopy of the laboratory analysis report documenting the supplements she had been adding to Warren's coffee. The compounds designed to elevate blood pressure, the substances that had systematically damaged his already weakened heart. The evidence that proved she had been slowly, deliberately poisoning him for months. I held it out to her. Vivian took the paper with trembling fingers. As her eyes scanned the document, all remaining color drained from her face. Her jaw dropped. She stumbled backward, catching herself against the stone pillar for support. Warren knew. My voice was quiet, but each word cut through the howling wind like a blade. He knew about you and Damien. He knew about the stolen business intelligence, and he knew exactly what you were putting in his coffee. He documented everything, Vivian, every pill, every sleepless night, every manufactured crisis. He knew you were killing him, and he let you do it because he needed time to set his affairs in order. Vivian was shaking so violently now that she could barely hold the paper. Her eyes were wide, filled with a terror that went beyond anything the cold could produce. He left me the original dossier, I continued. Everything his investigators found, everything his laboratory analyzed, everything he observed about your behavior in those final months. A complete record of your crimes ready to be handed over to the FBI whenever I choose. Please. The word came out as a sob. Please, Corinne. You can't. I'll do anything. I'll sign whatever documents you want. I'll admit everything. Just please don't give that to the police. Why shouldn't I? Because I'll spend the rest of my life in prison. Because I'll lose everything. Because... She trailed off, her hand moving instinctively to her stomach. Because I'm pregnant, Corinne. I'm carrying Damien's child. You can't send a pregnant woman to federal prison. You can't take a mother away from her child before it's even born. I watched her hand rest against her belly. I thought about the woman I'd been 3 years ago. The woman who had wanted children of her own, who had dreamed of filling a house with laughter and love, who had eventually accepted that Warren's ambitions would never leave room for the family she had imagined. I thought about all the things I had lost, all the dreams that had died, all the futures that would never be. And then I thought about who Vivian Hale really was. I'm not going to hand the dossier to the authorities, I said. Relief flooded her face. Her shoulders sagged. For a moment she looked almost human again. But I'm also not going to give you any money. The relief vanished, replaced by confusion and the first stirrings of renewed fear. I have conditions, I continued. You will sign a document prepared by my attorneys surrendering any and all claims to Warren's estate. You will agree never to contact me again, never to return to Montana, never to speak publicly about Warren or our marriage or anything that happened between us. You will disappear, Vivian, completely and permanently. And if you ever violate these conditions, if I ever see your face again or hear your name mentioned in connection with mine, the dossier will be transmitted to the FBI within 24 hours. She stared at me, processing the terms. That's it. You're just going to let me go. I'm letting you face the consequences of the trap Warren built for you. Bankruptcy, disgrace, The loss of everything you schemed and murdered to obtain. That's your punishment, Vivian. Not prison, not a trial. Just a lifetime of knowing that you destroyed yourself, trying to steal something that was never really yours. I reached into my pocket again and pulled out a second document. A legal agreement prepared by Ted's office, ready for her signature. Sign this and you can leave. Walk out those gates and never look back. Build whatever life you can from the ashes of your schemes. But know this, the dossier will exist for as long as I live. It will hang over your head like a sword on a thread. One wrong move, one violation of our agreement, and it falls. Vivian took the document with trembling hands. She read it quickly, her eyes scanning the legal language with the desperate attention of someone looking for a loophole and finding none. Then she looked up at me and something shifted in her expression. The desperation was still there, but beneath it, I saw something else emerging, something harder, something more familiar. The old Vivian, the calculating predator stirring beneath the surface of the broken woman who had been kneeling in the snow. "You think you're so much better than me?" she said. Her voice had changed, dropping the submissive tone she had been using. "You think you've won some great moral victory by letting me go instead of turning me in. But you're not better than me, Corinne. You're just luckier. Warren chose you in the end, that's all. He could just as easily have chosen me." "No." I kept my voice steady. "He couldn't. Because I never tried to kill him. I didn't kill him. His heart was already weak. You just helped it along." Vivian's jaw tightened. For a moment I thought she might refuse to sign, might choose pride over survival, might walk out into the storm and let whatever happened happen. But then her shoulders slumped again, and the hardness faded from her eyes, and she was just a broken woman standing in the cold, facing the ruins of everything she had built. "Fine." She pulled a pen from her coat pocket and signed the document with quick, angry strokes. "You win. You get the money. You get the estate. You get to be the saint who showed mercy to the villain. Congratulations, Corinne. I hope you enjoy your victory." She thrust the signed document at me. I took it calmly, folded it, and slipped it into my pocket. "There's one more thing," I said. Vivian paused, already turning toward the gates. "The pregnancy." Her back stiffened. "I know you're not pregnant, Vivian." She turned slowly, her face carefully blank. "What makes you say that?" "Because you are a woman who spent 14 months systematically poisoning her husband. A woman who conspired with his enemy to destroy his business. A woman who planned his murder with the same cold precision she applied to her beauty routine." I held her gaze steadily. "A woman like that does not get pregnant by accident. A woman like that does not allow herself to be tied down by a child she cannot control." Vivian stared at me for a long moment. Then, something broke in her expression. Something cracked, revealing the hollow desperation beneath. "How did you know?" "Because I know what you are, Vivian. I've spent weeks reading Warren's journal, studying his observations, understanding the woman who murdered him. And I know that everything you say, everything you do is calculated for effect. The pregnancy claim was your last manipulation, your final attempt to exploit my mercy." Vivian's eyes were wet now, though whether with tears or simply the cold I could not tell. "A woman willing to kill her husband wouldn't hesitate to lie about something like this," I said quietly. "Would she?" The silence stretched between us, filled only by the howling wind. Then Vivian laughed, a bitter, broken sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. "You're right," she said. "I'm not pregnant. I thought maybe if you believed—" She shook her head. "It doesn't matter. You saw through me, just like Warren did in the end. I spent 3 years with that man and I never really knew him. But he knew me. He knew exactly what I was capable of, and he planned for it." She looked up at the manor, at the warm light spilling from its windows, at the life that could have been hers if she had simply loved Warren instead of trying to destroy him. "I actually loved him once," she said softly. "In the beginning. Before Damien convinced me that love was weakness, before I started seeing Warren as just another mark." Her voice cracked. "Isn't that pathetic? I destroyed myself trying to steal something I could have just asked for." I said nothing. There was nothing to say. Vivian turned and began walking toward the gates, her shoulders hunched against the wind. Her expensive shoes left deep prints in the snow, a trail of evidence that would be erased by morning. At the iron gates, she paused and looked back one final time. "He really did love you," she called out. "Warren. Even when he was married to me, even when he was pretending that I was everything he wanted. He never stopped talking about you in his sleep, calling your name, reaching for someone who wasn't there." Then she walked through the gates and disappeared into the storm. I watched until her taillights faded into the swirling white darkness. Then I turned and walked back inside the warm embrace of Crestwood Manor, closing the heavy oak door firmly behind me. The confrontation was over. Vivian Hale was gone, and I was finally truly free. 8 months later, spring came to the mountains of Montana. The snow melted from all but the highest peaks, revealing meadows thick with wildflowers in shades of purple and yellow and white. The lake shook off its winter ice and began reflecting skies so blue they seemed almost artificial. Birds returned from their southern migrations, filling the pine forests with songs that had been absent for months. I had spent the winter learning my new home. I discovered which floorboards creaked at night and which doors stuck in humid weather. I learned that the kitchen was coldest in the morning and warmest in the late afternoon when the western sun poured through the windows. I found that the library had the best light for reading, with tall windows that faced south and comfortable chairs positioned to catch the warmth. Mrs. Braddock taught me to bake bread using a recipe that had been in her family for 4 generations. The first dozen loaves were disasters, too dense or too flat, or burned on the bottom and raw in the middle. But I persisted, and gradually the loaves improved until I could produce something that Mrs. Braddock pronounced acceptable. I learned to ride horses. Chester Rawlings helped me select 2 gentle mares from a ranch outside Bozeman. They were patient animals, accustomed to nervous riders, and they tolerated my amateur attempts at horsemanship with what seemed like bemused resignation. My instructor was a woman named Dorothy, who had been teaching people to ride for 40 years. At 58, I was probably her oldest student, but she never made me feel foolish for starting so late. "The horses don't care how old you are," she told me during my first lesson. "They only care if you're honest." Honest. That was a word I'd been thinking about a lot. I was honest with Mrs. Braddock when I told her that I still felt like an imposter in Warren's house. Honest with Ted Calloway when he asked if I had forgiven Warren for everything he had put me through. Honest with myself when I admitted that some wounds might never fully heal. But I was also finding moments of genuine peace. The quiet satisfaction of a bread loaf that rose properly. The thrill of finally cantering across the meadow without falling off. The simple pleasure of sitting on the porch at sunset, watching the light change across the mountains, knowing that I had nowhere else to be and nothing else I needed to prove. Mabel Jennings came to visit every month, making the 4-hour drive from Billings with stories about the town I used to know. She had sold the laundromat over the winter, but she still lived in her small house, still kept in touch with the people whose lives had intersected with hers during those late-night shifts. "You look good," she told me during her April visit. We were sitting on the porch, watching the last of the snow melt from the western slopes. "You look like someone who's finally getting enough sleep." "I'm trying." "Are you happy here?" I considered the question carefully. "I'm becoming happy. I'm not sure I'm there yet, but I'm closer than I've been in a long time." The discovery happened on a warm day in late May. I had been putting off cleaning the basement for months. The underground level of the manor was vast, filled with decades of accumulated possessions. Old furniture covered with dust cloths, boxes of documents that no one had looked at in years, equipment for hobbies Warren had apparently pursued and abandoned over the decades, fishing rods and golf clubs and woodworking tools, skis and hiking boots and camping gear, the remnants of a life that had been lived in fits and starts, picked up enthusiastically and then discarded when the next distraction came along. In a corner behind a broken rowing machine and several boxes of Christmas decorations, I found a wooden chest. It was made of oak, darkened with age, with brass fittings that had turned green with oxidation, Dust lay thick on its surface, undisturbed for years. The lid was heavy and the hinges protested loudly when I finally managed to lift it. Inside, I found letters, 247 of them to be exact. I counted later, sitting on the basement floor surrounded by paper trying to understand what I was holding. Each letter was addressed to me. Each was carefully dated in Warren's handwriting, and each had never been opened because none of them had ever been sent. The earliest was dated 1 week after our divorce was finalized. The most recent was written 3 days before Warren died. I had found brief references to me scattered throughout his journals, occasional mentions that hinted at deeper feelings. But I had no idea Warren had been writing to me every week for 3 years. I had no idea he had poured his heart onto paper, documenting his regret, his longing, his growing awareness that he had made the worst mistake of his life. I sat on the cold concrete floor, surrounded by dust and spider webs and the forgotten possessions of a man who was no longer alive, and I began to read. The first letter was short, just a few paragraphs written in a hand that shook slightly as if the writer had been struggling to control his emotions. My dearest Corinne, I signed the papers today. You are no longer my wife. The words feel wrong even as I write them. You were my wife for 15 years. You will always be my wife in some corner of my heart that Vivian will never be able to reach. I turned the page, and the letter continued. I'm sitting in my study, and it is 2 a.m, and Vivian is asleep upstairs, and I cannot stop thinking about what I have done. I threw away the best thing in my life for a woman I do not even like. A woman who is beautiful and young and completely empty inside. A woman who looks at me and sees only dollar signs. I set the letter down and picked up another dated several weeks later. I drove past our old apartment today, the one we lived in when we first moved to Billings. Remember how small it was? Remember how the radiator clanked all night and the neighbors played their music too loud, and we used to lie in bed laughing about how someday we would have a real house with real walls that actually blocked sound? The letter went on for 2 more pages, memories tumbling out in an uncontrolled stream. Our first Christmas together, when we could only afford a tiny tree that we decorated with popcorn strings and paper ornaments. The night I told him I was leaving nursing to help with his business, and he cried because he felt guilty for needing me so much. The vacation to Yellowstone, where our car broke down, and we spent 3 days camping by the side of the road waiting for parts to arrive, happier than we had ever been. Letter after letter, week after week, month after month. Warren had written to me while Vivian slept beside him. He had written to me while his business crumbled under Damien's attacks. He had written to me while his health deteriorated and his heart weakened and his body moved inexorably toward the grave. Letter 47, written about a year after the divorce. I stood outside the laundromat for 20 minutes today. You were helping a young mother with her children, entertaining the little ones while she sorted her loads. You were so patient with them, so gentle. I remembered how you always wanted children, how we talked about it in the early years, how I kept saying we would have them someday when the business was more established. I felt tears building behind my eyes but refused to let them fall. We never did have those children. I was always too busy, always too focused on the next deal, the next acquisition, the next milestone that would somehow make everything worthwhile. And now it is too late. I am dying, Corinne. I can feel it in my chest, in the way my heart stumbles over beats it used to make without effort. Vivienne thinks her supplements are a secret, but I know exactly what she's doing. I'm letting her do it because I need more time. Time to move the assets, time to set up the trust, time to ensure that when I am gone you will have everything she tried to steal. Letter 156, written about 6 months before his death. I have confirmed my worst fears about Vivian. The laboratory results came back today. She is killing me, Corinne. The woman I left you for is poisoning me with the same cold efficiency that I used to admire in my business competitors. And the worst part, the absolute worst part, is that I deserve it. I betrayed you. I broke every promise I ever made, and now I'm paying the price. The final letter was dated 3 days before Warren's heart attack on the golf course. It was longer than the others, more carefully composed, as if Warren had known it would be his last. My dearest Corinne, my Ellie, my love. If you are reading this, then I am gone and Ted has done what I asked. He has brought you to Crestwood Manor. He has shown you the trust. He has given you the evidence of Vivian's crimes. I could barely see the words through my tears now, but I kept reading. I do not know what you will do with that evidence. I do not know if you will choose justice or mercy. But I hope whatever you decide that you will understand why I did what I did. Not the leaving. I will never be able to explain that. I still do not understand it myself. But the rest of it, the trap, the trust, the years of watching you from a distance, unable to help, unable to reach out, unable to do anything except plan for a future I knew I would never see. The letter continued, Warren's handwriting growing slightly unsteady as he approached the end. I hope you can be happy at Crestwood. I hope you can find peace in these mountains that I could never find in all my money and success. I hope you can build a life here surrounded by people who knew me as I truly was, not the monster I became in the world outside these gates. And then the final paragraph. The words that I would carry with me for the rest of my life. You were the only real thing in my whole artificial life. I was too stupid and too proud to see it until it was too late to ask for forgiveness. But I hope that someday you can think of me without hatred. I hope that somewhere in your heart you can remember the boy who fell in love with a nursing student in a crowded bar in Bozeman. The boy who knew within 5 minutes that he would love her for the rest of his life. I kept that promise, Ellie, even when I broke every other one. Forever yours, Warren. I sat in that basement for hours. The light changed around me as the afternoon faded into evening. The air grew cold as the sun set behind the mountains. Braddock came looking for me eventually, drawn by my absence from dinner, and found me sitting on the concrete floor surrounded by 247 letters. She did not ask questions. She simply sat down beside me on the dusty floor, put her arm around my shoulders, and held me while I cried. I cried for the marriage that had ended too soon. I cried for the years I had spent hating a man who had never stopped loving me. I cried for the life we could have had, should have had, if Warren had been stronger or wiser or less susceptible to the manipulations of a beautiful predator. I cried for myself, for all the pain I had endured, for all the dignity I had maintained in the face of poverty and abandonment, for the woman I had been and the woman I was becoming, and the uncertain path that stretched out before me. And when the tears were finally exhausted, when there was nothing left inside me but a vast echoing emptiness, I made a decision. I gathered all 247 letters and put them back in the wooden chest. I closed the lid carefully, making sure the brass fittings were secure. Then I carried the chest up from the basement, through the manor, and into my bedroom. I placed it in the closet behind the clothes I would probably never wear, in a corner where it would be out of sight but not out of reach. I didn't need to read those letters again. I had read them once and that was enough. The words were inside me now, part of my story, part of the complicated legacy Warren had left behind. They would stay with me forever whether I looked at them or not. But I did not want to destroy them either. They were proof that even flawed people were capable of love. They were evidence that regret was real, that people could know they had made terrible mistakes, even when they lacked the courage to fix them. They were a testament to the complexity of human hearts, to the way good and evil could coexist in the same chest, beating together with every breath. Warren Prescott was not a good man. He was selfish and proud and cruel. He had abandoned me for a younger woman and allowed his lawyers to take everything I had. He had watched me struggle and suffer and rebuild my life from nothing, and he had done nothing to help because he was too busy building his elaborate trap. But he was also a man who loved me, a man who never stopped loving me, even when his actions said otherwise, a man who spent 3 years writing letters he knew I would never read, simply because he could not bear the thought of not communicating with me somehow. I didn't know how to reconcile these two versions of the same person. Maybe I never would, but I had decided that I didn't need to reconcile them. I didn't need to forgive Warren or condemn him. I did not need to decide whether his love redeemed his cruelty or his cruelty negated his love. I simply needed to live my own life, build my own future, become the person I wanted to be in the home he had given me with the resources he had left behind. That was the only answer I had found. And for now, it was enough. Another autumn came to Montana. The leaves on the aspens turned gold, then orange, then a deep russet that seemed to glow in the afternoon light. The mountains wore their first dusting of early snow-white caps against a sky so blue it made the eyes ache. The lake reflected everything, creating a mirror world where up and down lost all meaning. I had been at Crestwood Manor for over a year now. The woman who had arrived that first day, shell-shocked and disbelieving, seemed like a stranger to me. She had been so uncertain, so afraid, so convinced that the gift Warren had left her would be snatched away at any moment. She had carried her poverty like a wound, convinced that the good fortune could not possibly be real. That woman was gone. In her place was someone I was still learning to recognize, someone who woke up each morning without dread, someone who went to sleep each night without fear, someone who had learned that peace was not the absence of pain, but the presence of purpose. I could ride a horse now. Not expertly, but competently enough that Dorothy had stopped worrying about me falling off. The two mares in the stable had become my companions creatures, who expected nothing from me except honesty and kindness. They didn't care about my past or my money or the complicated circumstances that had brought me to this place. They only cared that I showed up each day with treats in my pocket and a willingness to learn. I could bake bread that Mrs. Braddock pronounced more than acceptable. The kitchen that had once intimidated me with its professional equipment and vast expanses of counter space had become my favorite room in the house. I would spend hours there, kneading dough and watching it rise, finding a meditative peace in the ancient rhythms of flour and water and yeast. I had read my way through a significant portion of the library. History and biography and philosophy and the occasional novel. Books Warren had collected over decades, many of them never opened, waiting for someone who had time to actually read them. And I had started keeping a journal of my own. Not letters to anyone living or dead, just a record of my days. The weather and the wildlife and the small moments that made up a life. The satisfaction of a problem solved, the beauty of a sunset witnessed, the simple pleasure of a cup of tea drunk in silence while the fire crackled and the world outside the windows slowly turned white with snow. Mabel sold her house in Billings. She bought a small cabin about an hour's drive from Crestwood, close enough to visit regularly but far enough to maintain her independence. We saw each other every few weeks now, two women who had found each other at the hardest point in both their lives and discovered a friendship that neither had expected. She had changed too. The laundromat was behind her now, along with the 16-hour shifts and the constant struggle to make ends meet. She had used the money from the sale to buy her freedom just as I had inherited mine. We would sit on my porch, or hers drinking coffee and watching the mountains talking about everything and nothing. "Do you ever think about Warren?" she asked me one afternoon in early October. The aspens were at their peak, the hillsides blazing with color, and the air was crisp with the promise of coming winter. "Every day," I admitted, "not always in the same way, sometimes with anger, sometimes with sadness. Sometimes with something that might be gratitude, though I'm not sure that's the right word for it." "Sounds complicated." He was a complicated man. Most of them are. Mabel smiled, the lines around her eyes deepening with something that might have been wisdom or simply the accumulation of years. "Have you forgiven him?" I thought about the question for a long moment. "No," I said finally. "I don't think I have, but I've stopped needing to. Does that make sense?" "More than you know." Chester and Opal Rawlings had become something like family. They came by every week or two with casseroles and gossip and the comfortable presence of people who expected nothing from me except good company. They had known Warren as a neighbor and friend, and they had welcomed me with the casual warmth of people who understood that community was built one small kindness at a time. Their ranch was thriving now. The years of struggle were behind them, the debts paid off, the herds rebuilt. Chester still woke up at dawn every morning to check on the cattle, and Opal still baked pies that won ribbons at the county fair. They lived simply and well, two people who had learned that happiness had very little to do with wealth. Pastor Whitaker continued to invite me to Sunday services, and I continued to occasionally accept. The little white church in Pinewood had become a familiar place, filled with faces I had come to know. People who had their own complicated relationships with God and faith and the mysteries of existence. People who asked nothing of me except that I show up and participate in the shared ritual of community. I had not found religion, but I had found something almost as valuable. A sense of belonging. A feeling that I was part of something larger than myself. A place where my presence mattered, however small, however temporary. It was evening now. I sat on the wraparound porch of Crestwood Manor, a cup of tea cooling in my hands. The sun was setting behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold and deep, rich purple. The lake reflected the colors perfectly, creating a world of fire and light that seemed to go on forever. Orange was my favorite color. Warren had known that. Somewhere in those letters he had mentioned it, how I always stopped to watch orange sunsets, how my face would light up when autumn came and the world turned the color of flames. He had noticed things like that, things no one else paid attention to, things I had barely been aware of myself. I thought about him now as the sky slowly darkened and the first stars appeared. Not the Warren who had left me, not the Warren who had instructed his lawyers to take everything, but the other Warren, the one who had written those letters, the one who had watched me from across the street too afraid to come inside, the one who had sacrificed months of his life to ensure my future. Warren Prescott had loved me. In his flawed, broken, insufficient way, he had loved me until his last breath. The letters proved that. The trust proved that. The elaborate trap he had built for Vivian, the fortune he had hidden away from me, the home he had prepared in secret, all of it proved that. He had loved me the only way he knew how, and I had chosen to live, not because I had forgiven him, not because I had made peace with everything that had happened, but because I deserved to be free, because I had earned this life through 3 years of suffering and struggle and the stubborn refusal to be destroyed. The sky was fully dark now, filled with more stars than I could count. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of light, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out to the night. I finished my tea and stood up slowly, stretching muscles that had grown stiff from sitting too long. The house behind me glowed with warm light, welcoming me back inside to the fire and the books and the quiet companionship of Mrs. Braddock's evening routines. This was my life now, not the life I had planned, not the life I had imagined when I was young and naive and believed that love conquered all, but a good life nonetheless. A life built on the ashes of old dreams in a place I had never known existed, surrounded by people who had become my family through proximity and kindness rather than blood. Warren Prescott was not a good man, but he had given me something precious in the end. Not just the money or the estate or the security of knowing I would never struggle again. He had given me the chance to start over, to become someone new, to discover what I was capable of when I was not defined by my relationship to him. I walked back inside and closed the door behind me. The fire was burning low in the library, and Mrs. Braddock had left a plate of cookies on the side table. I settled into my favorite chair, picked up the book I'd been reading, and let myself be absorbed by someone else's story for a while. Outside, the stars continued their ancient dance across the Montana ski. The mountains stood sentinel in the darkness. The lake lay still and silver in the moonlight. And somewhere in a closet behind clothes, I would probably never wear 247 letters rested in an oak chest waiting for a day that might never come. They were part of my story now, part of who I had been and who I was becoming. But they did not define me. Nothing did anymore except the choices I made each day, the kindness I showed to others, the life I built with my own 2 hands. Warren had given me the raw materials, but I was the one doing the building, and that in the end was the greatest gift of all.